So I hope I painted a fair picture, but I'm not necessarily sure that I did. So I hope you'll be able to go someday and experience it for yourself. I wanted to read a couple of my favorite sections from the book this evening and give you an idea of a little bit of where I'm coming from again and why I decided to write this. The first section is, I was trying to be very careful about not giving away any of the major details, but the first section is Abena, who again is a 15-year-old Mozambican girl. She's selling mangoes one day for her family in the market, as many of the young women do in the markets, when an American man shows up out of nowhere and approaches her. And she can't really understand what's going on. So with that, I will share a little bit of the story with you. So it says, the gentleman who decides to take her, by the way, is a gentleman named Arthur. He's not really a gentleman, just to give you a good idea. He's kind of a jerk. Arthur and Abena hadn't made it to Maputo before he pulled over the Jeep. Traveling south from Beira in the sometimes paved but mostly dirt road made the girl nauseous. Her head rested gently against the frame of the Jeep. Abena thought about the violence and emotions of the previous week. How had this week gone by so quickly? How could this have happened? How could she get away from this sickly, sweet-smelling man? She hadn't ridden in a private car before, but once traveled to a northern village by bus to visit her paternal grandmother. Mika reminded her for years afterward what a luxury that excursion had been. Personal vehicles were as uncommon as American businessmen in Mozambique. This odd combination of rarities turned a few curious heads as the two made the trek from the northern city into the country's capital. It was normal to see expats with houseboys, but rarely girls. The exception was the growing sex trade industry, but foreigners typically went child shopping after hours under the cover of night. Just 2 days before, life in Abena's sleepy Beira bounced along to a traditional drums beat. The men sat along grassy medians in the decaying streets, sunning themselves and plotting how to get their next beer. Women hustled their exhausted, skinny legs to their rice paddies, their farms, their market stalls. Older children worked for their parents and begged from the occasional tourist. Young children ran behind their mothers, crying to be suckled. Beira is one of the poorest cities in one of the world's poorest countries. People go hoping for variation to their dismal routine long ago. People stopped hoping for variation to their dismal routine long ago. Mika's generation knew no other life. To Abena, her village outside Beira was a wonderful place where she thought she'd one day raise her own family. To the vacationing Westerner, Arthur found this perspective to be the perfect example of fatalism. This desolate life of dirt, hunger, and disease was hard to visit, much less claim as your own. The few tourists who came to Mozambique rarely grasped the idea that amid the chaos, the people are truly happy. The majority of women will have children when they are still children. Their exhausted bodies will produce child after child until they cannot have another. A fourth of these children will die of AIDS before their second birthday. Many others will painfully die from malaria, cholera, and leprosy. This cornucopia of infectious disease make those who have survived feel strangely lucky, but still not privileged. Abena was no different. The week before Arthur surprisingly stopped at her stall in the crowded market, she helped her mother deliver twins. Mika grunted and moaned between pushes. The tiny babies were dead before they left the womb. Grunts turned to sobs as the woman watched the lifeless remains of her children lie still after Abena placed them on her belly. Now, Abena tried not to let herself think too much about these babies, how their pink skin starkly contrasted the black of her mother's belly, how that sob was the first emotion she'd heard from her mother in weeks. "I'm not having babies," she promptly told Mika after cleaning up the kitchen dirt floor where the sudden delivery had taken place. "Abena, shut your mouth. Do you think this is what I want to hear now?" her mother growled. "You'll have babies just like the rest of us, and you'll have dead ones too. We all do. Now, help me get those dogs away from the blood." Abena carried the placenta and the twins outside. She carefully wrapped them in banana leaves and dropped them into the latrine away from the reach of the hungry animals at her feet. They snarled at the scent as the scent fell below. When the green bundles hit the seawater at the bottom of the pit, Abena grimaced. "Adios, irmãs," she whispered thoughtfully. "Goodbye, my sisters." She remembered to tie the banana leaves close this time. She thought of these girls and her other siblings as she sat in her market stall the next day. Abena often spent her time daydreaming of the life she'd lead, of the home she'd have. Things would be different for her. She wouldn't have dead babies. I know that's kind of a rough section to read. I wanted to pick something from the first chapter again to not give too much away, but I also didn't want to sugarcoat the difficulty of life that I'm trying to describe. In Mozambique, though, the average lifespan is 37, if you can imagine. So when I was there working from age 23 to 28. I was past middle age. And the women I was working with thought I was just this, most of them pitied me because I wasn't married and I didn't have children. They thought I was some sort of freak. And to have an advanced degree made them very, very confused. And I was about 6 to 8 inches taller than most of them. So I was this giant freak of nature. But I don't, it's funny to laugh at that now, and yet the life for them there is just, it's so different from the luxury I grew up in middle-class America. And so I wanted to share that section in particular because I don't think the scene I just read is that uncommon, unfortunately. But this is a book of hope. I know that's a very sour note to talk about, but it is, there's a lot of happiness that happens here as well. Some of the passion that also drove my interest in writing was that I've been able to travel to a lot of different places in the world and to also see a lot of different public health successes. And I would like to share one of the public health successes that Esperanza has made possible. Malaria kills 3 million children a year, and it's one of those diseases that very rarely is spoken of because mosquitoes are so hard to control. Although, if you're an avid NPR listener, a couple weeks ago there was a U of A scientist on that talked about this new super breed mosquito that doesn't carry malaria, which is a little Jurassic Park and terrifying to me because all I can imagine is them like launching the super mosquito in Africa and watching to see what happens, which is probably what's going to happen. But malaria is not something that we talk about a whole lot. But on occasion, malaria pops up right here in Arizona. And the only reason we don't have malaria in Arizona is because we used DEET to get rid of it once upon a time. And then internationally, once we got it out of the United States, we decided that DEET was no longer appropriate for international use. So people die of malaria all the time, unfortunately. Esperanza realizes that the easiest way to prevent malaria is to distribute mosquito nets. If you can prevent the mosquitoes from getting to the people, you prevent the disease. And it's one of those diseases, as my African roommate over here in pink can tell you, who's had it 17 times, it's not fun. I mean, it's a disease that will kill, it usually kills the youngest, and are the most vulnerable. But a malaria net costs like $3, and they treat them with insecticide so they last for years. So if you can get people sleeping under a malaria net for $3 a piece, you can save an entire family. And we distributed, when I was with the project in Mozambique, we distributed more than 10,000 nets, and they were saving lives every day. So I hope that if you have a chance to read this, you'll start thinking a little bit more about, not only about the luxuries we have here, because we get mosquito bites here, right? I mean, how awful is this weather right now? I'm sure everybody in this room has been bitten by a mosquito in the last couple weeks. But if you can imagine that mosquito biting you and then causing a strange fever and then you dying, 6 days later, we would probably be paying a lot more attention to it if it was in Arizona or in the United States. There is really good work that is happening, and there are a lot of fantastic things that are happening progress-wise in Mozambique because of Esperanza and other really committed nonprofits. One of the organizations that we also partnered with there is called Care for Life, and they're also based here in the Valley. They are an LDS-funded organization out of Gilbert, and the founders of that organization are a couple named Cindy and Blair Packard, And Cindy and Blair raised 6 children in Gilbert, and they were working in Mozambique. Cindy was working as a midwife, and she was working in an orphanage, and she decided to adopt a child from Mozambique. And there was a very brief period of time where international adoption was allowed there. And they went through the entire process of adopting a young girl whose name is Lindy, who they have now at their home in Gilbert. And I worked with the Packards a lot in writing this book because I wanted to get the details right. Both the capital city, Maputo, where I've never traveled to, and also the details of the legalities in working in Mozambique. If you can imagine, when the Portuguese left in the late 70s, Mozambique was left without a class of people